Good morning. Welcome to another session of our Sunday morning Bible class where we've been in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Today we're going to be in 1st Kings 11. We're going to be talking about Solomon being too smart for his own good and how bad choices have consequences. Wyatt a few weeks ago had talked about Solomon's request for wisdom and how Solomon, God granted that, and there's a lot of examples of how Solomon put that wisdom to good use. Like all people, as we tend to gain wisdom and experience, and in Solomon's case, wealth and power beyond measure, we tend to lose our way. And man, Solomon really loses his way. And there's some significant consequences, not just for him, but for the people of Israel. We want to talk about that. And, as we go through this, we can absolutely talk about the consequences that came from his bad choices. But I always want to keep in mind the good news, which is we're all going to make bad choices. There will be consequences, but we are forgiven for our bad choices because of the sacrifice Jesus made. And now, in this context of this story, obviously this is way before Jesus' time, and the consequences are actually quite awful. But when we start wrapping this up at the end of today, I just always want to remember, although there are consequences to the things we do and the choices we make, and sometimes they're good consequences, sometimes they're bad. In the end, God's love for us outweighs it all. So, although we're in 1 Kings 11, I actually want to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 17 and look at verses 14 through 20. And in Deuteronomy, God's giving the Israelites rules and laws after they've come out of Egypt. And this is amazing to me because, this is hundreds of years before Solomon's time, and yet, in David's time, and Saul's time. And yet in verse 14, what we start off with is the title of this in my Bible anyway, is the king. So in Deuteronomy, God already knows what's going to happen down the road in regards to the Israelites' desire for a king. So he gives them, the king, specific instructions. And some of these are, he must not acquire a great number of horses for himself, or make peace with Egypt. He shouldn't take many wives because his heart will be led astray. He should not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. And when he took the throne, God's instructions were, write this down, put it beside you, read it every day so that you can remember, because he knows human nature. And so he's given them specific things. And, as a young boy, when I was growing up and I was given rules or I was given restrictions, man, and I'm going to be quite honest, even as a 43-year-old man today, rules and restrictions chafe. Somebody telling me what to do is hard for me to accept and deal with a lot of times. I want to know why. I want to know why you want me to do something. Don't just tell me to do it. Explain it to me. And God did explain why. Your heart will be led astray. If you intermarry with other cultures and religions, then you'll lose your focus on me and drift away. So he explained why, but yet the people of Israel really had a hard time following the rules that he had put forth. And we're going to see that Solomon just basically blew them out of the water and had no regard for the law that was set down in Deuteronomy. So we know that Solomon was wise. We know that Solomon was very successful in the eyes of the world. So in 1 Kings chapter 10, in 23 through 29, I'm going to read this because I think it's a really vital part to the lesson today. King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. Year after year, everyone who came brought a gift, articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons, and spices, and horses and mules. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Kue. The royal merchants purchased them from Kue. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. They also exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and of the Arameans. So right out of the gate, Solomon's, he's got horses from Egypt. That's the first one he's broken in regards to law. But I also want to take a step back and think about Solomon. Solomon's the smartest man in the world. Solomon is the richest man in the world. For a comparison today, Solomon might be Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos. And he has got everyone coming to him, telling him how smart he is, he is the richest man in the world. He's the most powerful king on earth. And like all human beings, when we have that type of success, it is very hard for us to remain humble. Jesus says it's easier for a camel to thread the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. And there's reason for that. The reason is when we gain wealth, when we gain power, when we gain earthly knowledge, we tend to start believing that we have done it all. That look at what I have built. Look what I have done. And I think that's what's happened here with Solomon. The success has gone to his head. And at this point, he truly believes that, God gave me this wisdom. I'm smart. So if I make a decision, then it's the right decision. And so and then in other ways, I think he starts to believe that I can do these things because I won't fall to those temptations. I'm smarter than that, right? And how many times do we justify that we can do something, we can be around someone, we can be in a certain area because we won't fall for that. We know what happens, yet time and again, we continue to make the same mistakes. One of the things that I got from reading all of this is, no matter how smart you are, no matter how much education you have, no matter how much biblical knowledge you have, you are always going to be susceptible to making a mistake. You are not perfect. I am not perfect. And we can gather knowledge, whether that's worldly knowledge, whether that's scriptural knowledge. And man, we think we know it all, when the fact of the matter is we know nothing. I loved the Game of Thrones shows, and one of the famous lines is, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." And the truth of the matter is we don't. There's so much that we don't understand. And if you have kids that ask you questions all the time, it becomes very evident that you can be the smartest man in the world, and there's still so many things you don't know. And that's true with anything that you do. So we move to chapter 11, and here's where Solomon really messes up. So in order to create these trade deals, in order to create peace treaties with countries around him, Solomon, to seal a deal, so to say, marries women. He marries the daughters of kings. He marries the daughters of tribal warlords. And a lot of times this is, in that culture, how they sealed a pact. Well, obviously, he was very successful, a very prominent, wealthy man. He made a lot of treaties and trade deals, and he ended up with over 700 wives. And then on top of that, he had 300 concubines, 1,000 women. And the likelihood that Solomon even knew who some of these people were is probably very small. But the fact of the matter was, when you have that many people from that many different cultures and religions together, eventually, I can only imagine how many times a wife would come to him and say, "I need to worship my gods," and I kind of see it as, and this is my opinion, I want to be clear. Maybe in the beginning Solomon was very strict. No, God is our God. He is the only God. This is who you will worship. Maybe that was wife 100 through 200. And then 250 to 400 are like, we want to worship our gods. We need to go out and worship our gods. And I can only imagine that eventually he just got beat down and said, go. If that's what you want to do, I don't know you. I don't love you. I don't really care about you. You are just part of a trade deal. Do what you got to do. And what ends up happening is we see him enable the worship of two very bad gods, Ashtoreth and Molech. So Ashtoreth was the god of fertility. I'm going to stop right here and say we're about to enter into a little bit of adult content. So, if you have some children around you that are younger in age, you may want to pause and have them go do something else. But I think it's important to talk about this because we need to understand what they were worshiping. So let's get to Ashtoreth. Ashtoreth was the goddess of fertility. And she was a goddess that was quite honestly all throughout the region. But she was very prominent with the people in Canaan when the Israelites came in. You've heard mention of an Asherah pole. People would go and put Asherah poles in high places. They would go and worship this goddess in the hopes that they would get pregnant with sons. They wanted sons, not daughters. And the Asherah pole was actually a phallic symbol. We tend to cleanse the Bible about some of the rougher bits and parts, but they literally were putting phallic symbols in high places and worshiping in them. And there would be prostitutes in the temples of Ashtoreth. So, this was a very sexual god. It led to sexual immorality, which led to other consequences down the road. Once again, bad choices, bad consequences. And Solomon enabled this worship and even set up worship so that his wives and their people could worship this god. And as bad as Ashtoreth was, Molech was worse. Molech was a god of war, and he was a very angry god, and to appease Molech, they actually performed child sacrifice. In Israel, as you'll see, if as we go down these histories of the kings to come, unfortunately, really gets into Molech. Another name for Molech is Baal, which is one that you've heard quite a bit in the Bible. So when you see the prophets, fighting Baal, and you hear them talk about Molech, this is a bad dude, and he, the requirements to worship this god are to come and sacrifice your children, and Solomon lets this happen. Not only does he let this happen, he sets up worship places for it to happen. And so, this is where we see his, the laws that God set up in Deuteronomy, why God told him, don't marry many wives. Not just many wives, but, when he's bringing in these cultures from outside and these religions, he's not strong enough to say no. He's not strong enough to say, my God is the true God, worship him. In fact, I try and think, how do you enable child sacrifice, right? I mean, Solomon's a smart guy. The wisdom came to his heart. How does he get from that point to letting his people sacrifice to a God where he knows their children are going to be killed? And when this happens, this is it. I mean, this is God really comes back and basically blasts him. And in verses 9 through 13, this is what we get. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So God is not happy with Solomon, and basically comes to him and says, you got too big for your britches, and because I loved your father, I'm not going to do this while you're alive, but when you're done, the dynasty is over. And we're going to see as this goes on that in fact happens. Some questions I had while reading this part of the scripture was, we always hear that we are to be set apart, right? We are to be in the world, but not of the world. And I think this is the prime example of what God has been trying to tell people from the moment he brought them out of Egypt to 2020. Is that you can't go build a fortress and hide and keep this, we can't keep the good news to ourselves. Our job is to go out and spread the good news and help God's kingdom grow. But in order to do that, we have to be separate from the world. We can't fall into the temptations and the social norms that we see around us every day, because when we do, it takes our eyes off of him and causes us to go down paths that we should never even consider. And I think this is a really good example of how wealth and power and knowledge can corrupt. And it can make us lose sight of why we're here and what God has asked us to do for him. And, the other thing I thought about is today, especially here in the United States, we are one of the most educated groups of people that have ever walked the face of this planet. Our scientists know more. We have universities everywhere. We're doing research. We think we have a really good understanding of what's going on in our world. And yet, as educated and knowledgeable as we are, as I mentioned earlier, there's just still so much we don't know. Go do research about our oceans. We've lived on this planet for thousands, nobody knows how long. And we've even gone up to the moon, but we still don't know what's at the bottom of our ocean in a lot of ways. We still have places that have been undiscovered. And so as much as we think we know, we still have so much to learn. In the next part of the story, Solomon has died, and his son Rehoboam comes in and actually has a chance for a smooth transition. And in this part of the story, one of the things we find is bad choices don't just have consequences for us. Solomon's bad choices had consequences for him. He gained the Lord's anger. And Wyatt's going to talk next week about some of the bitterness that Solomon is going to talk about later in his life, when he really starts to understand what's going on and what he did. But the bad choices affected other people too. And so in 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 12 through 17, we get Rehoboam. Rehoboam's a piece of work. He's actually a terrible person when it's all said and done. And once again, we don't really know how old he was when he took the throne. But he grew up in the lap of luxury. He was Solomon's oldest son, so he was always meant to be the next king. And I have a feeling that Rehoboam may have been pretty much a spoiled brat, and we'll kind of see how that plays out. Some backstory here. You guys got a double dose on the temple, because Wyatt and I skipped a lesson and we just had some miscommunication. But one of the things we talked about on the temple was how Solomon used conscripted labor to build his temple and his palace and all his other capital projects that he built in the country. So Solomon was forcing people to work for him. It wasn't a choice. They had to. The other thing Solomon was doing was taxing them heavily. The country itself was prosperous, but the people were heavily taxed. And so when Rehoboam comes in, he has a chance to have a smooth transition and continue the dynasty of David. But there's a problem. The Israelites, the 11 northern tribes, they're tired. They're tired of being forced to work. They're tired of being heavily taxed. So when it comes time for Rehoboam to be a crowned king, they come together, and all the people come, and the 11 tribes of Israel, the northern tribes, say, if you will stop conscripting us, forcing us to work for you, and when you will lighten our tax burden so that we are, they say their yoke has been heavy with Solomon and we need you to lighten it. So they've asked him to give them some relief. And Rehoboam says, let me think about it. Go away for 3 days, come back, and we'll talk. And so the people leave, and Rehoboam goes to the elders, some of Solomon's advisors, some of the older people in the kingdom that have wisdom. And they say, and he asks them, so what do you think I should do? And their advice is, if you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. Which is interesting. That in itself could be a whole nother lesson right there on how to lead. If you want to lead, you have to serve. But it's great advice. And these people they've lived life. They have the experience. They've seen what Solomon's gone through. And man, they just gave him gold. And what does Rehoboam do? Old men. I'm going to talk to my buddies. They know what's really going on. They've been in the universities in Cairo, but they've got all this education. And so he goes to his buddies. He says, what do y'all think? Should I stop making them work so hard? Should I lighten their taxes? And they say no. And they actually say something really disrespectful to Solomon. And the scripture says, tell them my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. And all I want to say about that, it's a euphemism. Gosh, I can't talk. A euphemism. He's not talking about his little finger. And which makes me wonder, did he not respect his dad? This is Solomon. This is the greatest king the earth has ever seen. Or was he so worried about what his buddies and his peers thought that immature Rehoboam, puffs up his chest and says, well, I'll show them, I'm much better than my father. So Rehoboam goes with his buddy's advice. The Israelites come back. He meets with them, and he basically says, you thought my father was tough on you. You're about to see. He said, he said, he scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. So the people of Israel, the 11 northern tribes, say, try it, and they leave. And they don't make Rehoboam their king. And basically, what ends up happening is we have 100 years of civil war. The 11 tribes of Israel go north. The tribe of Judah stays south. We have a split kingdom. And we now have 100 years of pain and misery for a whole country because Rehoboam took bad advice. And what we see, I in a way, I'm not so old that I can't remember being in my 20s, my 30s, my late teens, and that story plays out so much, where we've got great advice from somebody who's lived life and been through the wars, but we think we know better than them. We're too smart for our own good. And so we go and we make the opposite decision. And 9 times out of 10, it doesn't work out the way we thought it was going to. And for Rehoboam, it doesn't. His kingship is not very long. It's very tumultuous. And it begins the end of Israel, because we see the tribes split, then we see the Assyrians come in, then the Babylons, then the Persians, and Israel is just torn apart. And until Jesus comes, there's just so much pain and anguish for the Israelites. And even after, if they, for a lot of them, we know the history of the Israelites, the Jewish people. From that moment on, they went from a unified kingdom, the most powerful kingdom on earth, to just thousands of years of pain. So what do we take away from this whole story of Solomon and Rehoboam and how bad choices have had the consequences? My first thing is, Solomon was a great man of the world. He was, if you went out into the streets and said, describe, what a great man is, he's smart, he's wealthy, he's powerful, people come to him for advice. He was all those things, but he was a terrible man of God. He failed miserably as a man of God. And I think that is a very powerful reminder for us that no matter how much we think we know, or how good we think we are, it's a struggle. And to be a follower of Christ and a man or a woman of God, it's tough. And especially in today, where we have more wealth and comfort than anyone ever has before us. One of the questions I ask is, are we more like Solomon, and that we tend to be concerned with what the world thinks about us more than what God is thinking about us? Do our actions every day in our work, at school, at home, they reflect what we believe God wants us to be, or do we reflect more on what the world expects from us? And that can come across in so many ways. In my next note was, do we get caught up being successful people and not godly people? How often, if we spend as much time focused on God as we do on our career, on our things, imagine what an amazing place this world could be. And then how do we avoid making the same mistakes as Solomon and Rehoboam? Number one, I think we need to listen to God. A lot of people think God's commands and his rules, commands, his laws, a lot of times they're requests, right? They feel like he says these things to keep us from experiencing the life, right? But God's commandments come from love. God's commandments come because he knows what the outcome is if you go down those paths. It's pain, it's misery, it's loneliness, it's a separation. And he's trying to keep us from having to experience that. But unfortunately, once again, we think we know better, and we can handle it, right? We can handle that temptation. I can be in that situation because I'm not going to be affected the same way. But that's not the truth. If you expose yourself to something enough, eventually you will fall. Another way I think we avoid making those same mistakes is we got to talk to God. We got to go and ask for his guidance. We have to ask for his guidance, and then we've got to be willing to hear him when he gives it to us. Many times, we may go and ask him to lead us, to tell us where we want to go, but we don't really listen when he tries to. And it's hard. It's hard to know all the time, but at the same time, I think sometimes God just lays something on you, and you know. And you know what the right path is, but yet we can still talk ourselves into doing something different because it doesn't fit with what we want. And then I think this is a big one. When we need advice from people, and especially in the church, we need to go to people who've been through those situations. When you try and talk to someone, for instance, if a mom and dad were to lose a child, if I went to talk to someone who'd never even had children to help me get over my grief, they might have a hard time relating to my experience and helping me through that. But if I were to talk with someone who has actually been through it, been through the experience, the pain, the hurt, the feeling, and can relate and understand where I am and what I'm going through, their ability to guide me through that awful, terrible moment is just so much greater because they've experienced it themselves. And I think that's one instance. In another instance, I think temptation and sin, because we all have them, we all fall. And more often than not, we're afraid to go talk to somebody about them because we're worried about being judged, or we're worried about, what are they going to think, or even they're going to let me, go to church there. What's going to happen? And I think we are blessed as a church whole, not just Bellevue, but the Church of Christ, with a wide swath of people who've had a wide range of experiences, good and bad. And there are people who've been in some really dark places, who've been able to find Jesus, hold on to Jesus, and let him guide them to the light and embrace the sacrifice he made and have that forgiveness and guide them where they can help others. And I think, to avoid making bad decisions, or to avoid, after we've made a bad decision, how do we keep our relationship with Christ intact? We've got to be able to talk about these things. And you're starting to see the church do a lot of more things around that. You're seeing churches do things like celebrate recovery. I've seen churches do divorce care, where they know people are hurt. They know where actions have caused bad consequences. And instead of pushing people away, they're embracing them and showing them how God's grace can overcome. So that knowledge, that wisdom of past experience needs to be shared. It needs to be shared so that people understand that God is not a spiteful God. God is not trying to keep us from experiencing things. God loves us. And the reason he tells us to walk the path is because it will keep us from experiencing hurt and pain. So, as we go through life, as we face temptation, as we have questions about, man, what should I do about this? It's really important that you find people that you can go and have open and honest conversations with and ask for their guidance and wisdom. Because if you try and do this on your own, or you try and go out to people who are not grounded in their faith, you're going to get bad advice. You're going to make bad decisions. It's just the way it works. I think the moral of this story is, no matter what we do in regards to trying to learn, and I think we should always be learning. I love to learn. I love history. If you haven't been able to tell, by the way, I do these lessons. I love to read. My wife will probably say, I think I know more than what I really do. But as much as I know, as much as any one of us knows, there's so much more we don't. And there's a reason God wants us to be in community and in fellowship, because we need the support of many people to help us stay focused on him. And we need to understand that no matter how much our knowledge grows, no matter how smart we get, we're not capable of doing it on our own. Solomon learned that the hard way. Rehoboam learned that, trying to do it on your own or trying to impress other people, it just doesn't work. So as we move forward through this week, let's really think about focusing on God, trying to listen to God, not counting so much on ourselves. America is a country of go-getters and self-reliant people, but we need to be relying on God. And if we're relying on God, then, the number of bad choices we make will decrease significantly. I appreciate you guys letting me teach y'all this quarter. Wyatt's going to finish this up next week, and then you'll have a couple new teachers going into the summer. But I hope this was edifying for you guys, and I appreciate the time. Have a great week.